Good evening and welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. We're here every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. We broadcast from the beautiful state-of-the-art M&N studios of the El Barrio Firehouse Community Media Center. The program is also repeated every Thursday at 8 p.m. on MNN4. This is a show that literally wants you to imagine a better world and offers, with your help, insights, visions, strategies to help bring about a more progressive and radical vision of humanity and what life could be like in that world. We want to make this show entertaining, informative, challenging, and very inclusive. The left is too often sniping at each other, destroying the chances of building that better world. After all, if we can't even be civil and humane toward each other, how can we claim to be the voice and way toward that more humane and civil world? Sectarianism and the authoritarian left is really a contradiction to the sort of broad left vision we imagine and hope to bring about in this show. We hope you saw our first show, which featured the country's leading public intellectual and revolutionary Christian, Cornel West, discussed the radical imagination with his old friend and comrade Stanley Aronowitz, distinguished professor of sociology at the Grad Center, City University of New York. Stanley will be a regular co-host on this show, as will the preeminent political rapper of his generation, Immortal Technique, Felipe Coronel. But tonight we are blessed on the show with another revolutionary Christian, Rev Stephen Phelps, who will offer his thoughts about a radical spiritual imagination, as well as his and my participation in the weekend activities of Rise Up October and the demonstrations, marches, and protests to stop police brutality and to shut down Rikers Island Prison. We'll be speaking with him later on in the show. And I'm also thrilled to welcome tonight my co-host, philosophy professor Michael Pelias. Our comrade political science professor Peter Bratsis cannot be with us here tonight, but we will hear from him in later shows. We all want to flesh out what we'll be doing on this show and explain the philosophy behind the radical imagination. And at the end of the show, you'll be given information on how to contact us so that this can truly become a cooperative and organic show of the people. So welcome, Michael. How are you?
I'm good, Jim. How are
Good.
you? Yeah.
It's great to see you and to start this show and help explain to our audience and to ourselves here what we're trying to do. What is the radical imagination? How did you get involved in this?
Maybe I'll take it first from a historical perspective, where the idea of the notion of the radical imagination came from. In 1964, a Greek exile from Greece after World War II, part of what I call the Greek boat people, they left because they were going to be executed by the then right government. Cornelius Castoriadis was his name, wrote a book called The Imaginary Institution of Society, in which he coined the phrase the radical imagination. And in this phrase, he spoke of the need to have what Gramsci had earlier called the war of position, that we do not have the ammunition or the weapons, external weapons to really take over, the state, or do we really want to take over the state? But we do have the means to educate ourselves and to, privilege education as a moment in terms of building the ground for a much more radical, transformative future. So Castoriadis was sort of the originator of this, as most of your audience, hopefully, and we know here, that 4 years later we had something called May of '68 in Paris, which was an attempt to take over the state that lasted for a close downing of the government for at least 30 days, and resonated globally among the youth, the generation of the 60s and early 70s, followed by the hot autumn in Italy in 1969. So anyway, taking this as a point of departure, about 10 years ago, Stanley Aronowitz, myself, Peter Bratsis, all part of the co-hosts here, got together, and with other people, I can mention some other names. Bruno Gulli certainly was active in this too, who was an Italian philosopher. Got together and we put together a journal called Situations Project of the Radical Imagination, which was an attempt to basically internally critique the left, to speak about how the left had been grounded more in what we called an ideology of economic determinism. And this is all it was interested in, really, about,
Tell us a little more about what that means.
Well, what that would mean is that the left is traditionally always looking in the last collapse of capitalism. So we have a collapse in 1973.
Imagining
its
demise.
Yes, exactly. Always imagining.
Always imagining.
Always an imagining. So we go even up to today. We have a very bad summer in the stock market and the equity markets and in this new, globalized financialization that we're undergoing.
Just around the corner.
Always around the corner, exactly.
Yeah. Right.
So anyway, we thought that the left had been too much embedded in discourses in political economy only or in economic reasoning. And what had been forgotten in this is culture, the cultural imagination.
Music, art, dance,
absolutely.
Comedy, so on.
Absolutely,
Food.
and food, yes, and then we may have a segment on this show called "Food as Thought," or "Food and Thought" may be better.
And spirituality,
and spirituality,
yes.
of course, the spiritual imagination, yes,
Right.
and that would be a very good long discussion, and we could certainly use the German word Geist in that capacity, which has resonations to community, not only spirit as such, but also community, being retranslated as that by Fred Jameson, for example. So anyway, so we tried to open this up. We issued a manifesto of what we meant by the radical imagination in our first issue, and have consistently been publishing at least 1.5 journals on average. We're coming out with a big double issue, probably in the next 6 weeks, or most certainly in the next 6 weeks. It's been probable, but now it looks certain we'll have it out in early December at the latest.
So you see this show as sort of a continuation, an expansion of these ideas, among other things, culturally and so on, to what? To prepare people or to raise consciousness? What are you attempting to do? These are not just professors here. Now that you want to deal with and debate these issues, right?
Right. Well, we would certainly like to bridge the gap between we see the left, at least from our part of our vision or part of our critique, which is I think also part of our vision, is that the left has been very good at protest. Right, and occasionally at resistance, but never good at really the overturning of the circumstances, the real transformational activity in the last year. So we're trying to push much more in that direction against the reformist tendencies, certainly against electoral politics. We see that as a dead end, et cetera. And part of the political project would be moving towards really a new, for lack of a better term, a party, but not really the traditional political party.
And you have a
party of education.
Okay.
Yes, and we have an institute for the radical imagination that we're giving. Yes, we're giving classes. We've done this now for almost 3 years. Primarily Stanley and myself. Peter Bratsis and Bruno Gulli have also offered classes. Stanley and I most consistently. That began at the now, as we know, defunct Breck Forum. We went to the Commons for a while. Now we're going to be offering, beginning this Saturday, 3 classes, one on class with Stanley himself.
This is in Brooklyn?
No, at the National Writers Union on 38th Street in Manhattan.
Wonderful.
256 West 38th Street, and it begins at 12 noon this coming Saturday. 8-week sessions for Stanley on class and class struggle, the notion of, and he would begin with a rereading of Marx's German ideology. And I'm sorry to put out all of this.
Do.
I mean, I'm trying to,
important.
you know,
It's
yeah,
important.
and I think it's important to go through some of the work. He will read Rick Wolf's Knowledge in Class as well as Stanley's own book, which has not been discussed so much, but should, called How Class Works. Okay. You know, so he'll be doing that. I am doing a course upon a prodding by many people, Plato's Republic for Revolutionaries. And the intention would be to kind of, you know, how does the left really offer a different vision? And what is the good society that we're trying to bring about, right? And what would that include?
Exactly.
And Plato has most of the elements, even though we may not agree with, you know, traditionally the Platonic idealism, or that Plato was a member of an aristocratic class during a period of slave society. The ideas are there that we can work with.
Germinating.
Yes, and I will be doing a parallel
another Greek
reading.
again,
yes,
right?
another Greek, right? A comparative reading with Alain Badiou, a contemporary French philosopher who has a tremendous amount of following, both in the United States and in Europe, who has rewritten the Republic for modern times. And actually has a character who is Plato's sister. So the woman gets her voice in here. And most of his examples are from contemporary left struggles. So we'll be doing both the ancient and the modern together in a kind of parallel reading and trying to problematize. And then finally, Peter, who's not here today, Bratsis is doing a course on Marxism and electoral politics, in which he'll be reading, you know, critiques, beginning with Marx, of course, on the Jewish question, early works of Marx, all the way forward to, you know, Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas on what is political power.
So this is filling a real vacuum, you feel.
I think so.
Intellectual life on progressive life.
Yeah.
And I, you know, this may be a time also to introduce and bring in our comrade here, our spiritual comrade, Stephen Phelps, Reverend Stephen Phelps.
Jim.
Friend of mine, and sometimes cellmate, although we decided not to pursue that route this morning, as we were involved in various demonstrations of resistance and some of the discussion that Steve and I had as we attempted to confront the Rise of October demonstrations is, where do we go from here now? And so as so Steve, anytime you feel like you'd like to jump in here and carry on with some of the Platonic interests that Michael has begun here, you must have, as a visionary, as a spiritual progressive, what do you think of these ideas here? How can you relate to them?
Well, this morning's events will perhaps be in the news. One never knows whether the newsmakers think this is news.
For our audience, again,
so we'll just wrap that up a little bit.
Tell us about it.
There are 3 days of activities in what's called Rise Up October, and the aim is to bring to the attention of the public the slaying of largely black and brown men and women by police forces that is going on and has really been going on essentially since 1492 without stop. And Americans are generally immune to this fact. They don't want to hear it. They have all kinds of resistance to it. This is an effort to break through for a few more, or maybe a lot more people. That would be the radical imagination, is that suddenly a lot of people, as I said yesterday in some comments, would begin to experience remorse for the evils that this system of economy has worked out upon the backs and the bodies, largely of persons of color, including, of course, the native populations of the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, so 3 days of this. Today's effort was, in a word, to shut down Rikers Island. So is that a radical imagination? Is that a crazy dream? Is it a practical alternative? It seems to me that if you go practical on it, instrumental, you say, well, wait a minute, there has to be some way of sequestering individual citizens who have behaved in violent ways. Just quickly move them out of the population if their violence has been experienced as dangerous in the community. So they call that a jail, if you will. Or, with Gilligan, invent a new system. But nevertheless, make the community safe quickly, and then test whether they in fact were correctly accused, and all of that is important. Right. Sometimes the move that follows is that those who are engaging in the resistance or the protest have to have the full solution all figured out before they register their deep anger and resistance to a system, an order that we presently have. I don't agree with that at all. I believe that the purpose of this kind of protest is in fact to change the perceiving of the problem, to problematize it, as you put it a moment ago. And the question of how the safety of the community can be expressed and realized through forces of what should someday be called justice, which presently deserve to be called the criminal American justice system. That's the right way to use those modifiers in my view. Well, we don't know what that would look like yet. That's part of what radical imagining would be. It's very political work. We're not able to engage in that practical thinking at this time because so many other factors have jammed us up in a completely unjust set of relations, largely with poor people.
And you find resistance to this within your own religious communities? Why aren't more of the faith leaders out there? Are they not aware of this yet, or do you feel there's a sort of resistance there, and that gets us into, again, okay, we're all...
Why aren't
they imagining the same thing you're imagining? And Michael is trying to get us to imagine, too.
Let me offer that this might be the same as your question. I'll phrase it a little differently.
Sure.
Why do the majority of religious leaders and religious people have no basic understanding or desire to move against the structures of power that are enforcing unjust systems? Well, in a way that's tautological. Why does the majority behave like the majority and insist on its power and do nothing about those who are oppressed? Mm-hmm. I think an economic analysis is probably adequate, which is the majority, at least this side of some kind of breakthrough that deserves the name revolution, the majority are always interested in keeping structures in place which keep the money flow and the relationships the way they are. And they're
terrifying. The political order that they
the whole thing
are surviving under, yeah.
And a feature of that in societies across the world, with a few exceptions, North Korea would be one, they religify their leader, right? They turn him into a quasi-religious figure. But a feature of religion historically has always been that some part of the religious mind, and I won't say imagination here, just the religious cast of religious philosophy, if you will, aligns with the conservative structures, the homeostatic principles of society. And it's very obvious that this is a feature of religious behavior, is to keep everything nailed down and to be extremely connected with conserving the structures that are there. However, and I won't go on and on here. I want to hear other comments.
No, but also tell us about your own experience with that person that commented against. All right, you'll get to that. Okay, because this is very important. Yeah.
Having said that,
yes,
religion can always be observed in its conservative expression. The fundamental, the founding, in that sense, fundamental. The founding of religious movements is subversive, has always been subversive in character. Not necessarily subversive of national, if it's nation states that are in question, of national structures, but subversive at the level of causing the individual to be free in his thought, in her thought, and therefore freer. in relationship to the structures of systemic oppression, and able, therefore, to stand up and be free and freely to resist. And then a step further. This is why religious people are so commonly the ones who suffer, intentionally accept the suffering from the state's oppressions. Because when the state works through fear, right? I mean, that's all states have a coercive function, which is do what we say, it will hurt you. We have a monopoly on the right to hurt you. That's a feature of state power. It's never going to go away. And the question is, am I afraid of being hurt? Most people, the answer is, of course. And in fact, let me put it a little differently. Unless you're crazy, the answer is, of course. Yeah. The body is afraid of being hurt. But some people, and to observe that this is often a spiritual and sometimes a religious phenomenon, to become conscious of why I will become more interested in my people's needs than I am in my body's needs for safety. I'm more interested in us and our healing and wholeness than I am in the integrity of my own skin. I think of John Lewis in an interview that he had with Bill Moyers, where he describes, and I've seen him do this a few times, and when he realized on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I was not afraid. Well, that's a critical moment in spiritual awakening, is that your body is not. And security and safety state, that fetish of the oppressive
state. So you're free.
You're free. And then you can, I'll just finish up with this thought. Then you're free to put your body on the line. We didn't choose to do that today.
Right.
But when
we had the show to do.
When people do that, sometimes media is the critical thing for some. There were others who chose to do that.
That's right.
But the state really has a hard time with people who freely allow themselves to be hurt by the state, because it is its only, it's its last resort, is to control through fear. It's a function of terrorism. It belongs among the tools of state function.
The mind,
to terrorize
the spirit, the body.
And when somebody says, I'm not terrorized, they are trouble. They're trouble for the state. And a last sentence, Howard Zinn says in People's History of the United States of America, no significant change toward justice in America has ever taken place. A, from writing your congressman, or B, without people allowing their backs to be broken by the state and its hench people, such as the corporate capitalists. And when they allow their bodies to be broken, and yes, they're frequently religious people who are able to do that more freely, not always, but frequently. When that happens, then the state's in trouble, and systems can change.
Well, Michael.
Well, he gave us a lot to think about here.
Subversive.
I mean, it's a very interesting discussion of the existential freedom that one has when one encounters one's mortality. And I think this is a very interesting part of the radical imagination that the left has also forgotten, that we have existential concerns, not only economic concerns. And this is very important to remember at this point. Yeah. Why have we forgotten? I think we've become complacent. And we always think we have, and this is a critique I have, is that we always think we have the right critique, and that somehow, by osmosis or by the contradictions of the systems, that things will fall apart by themselves. That there is no risk that really the people have to take, as Steve was mentioning, that this risk is never really taken anymore. So, which leads to the more radical question of where he began. I think that we should frame around the radical imagination, why is it that people choose their slavery than their freedom? And this is a very radical question that goes back to the time of Montaigne, his friend La Boétie. Some people think Montaigne was La Boétie, but voluntary servitude to a system why people become so comfortable within a system, or really so comfortable in their own minds and their critiques, and no longer can see what's really going on, nor can they really act. They may be able to react, but not really act, and act in a transformative way. So
They've
we see this all the
internalized.
time, yes,
Yeah,
and we
yeah.
see this in the writings, one of the great books of, on the psychology of fascism, of course, Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. How have we been in the United States subjected to the mass psychology of friendly fascism? And we go on, right, in so ways. And we yell, give us less bread and more taxes. Even though we don't demand this on the street, but essentially this is what happens. People actually are put in a position of acting against their own real interests and their self-interest. And one thing we do have in common is our mortality. And we have to think about this in terms of our actions going forward. And this existential, if you will, or even existential Marxist tradition, a la Sartre, who is also, I think, a great proponent of the radical tradition, needs to be retrieved. Beyond that of that, we have, global financialization going on. We have, these kind of moments where people are, down, or that the prisoners themselves, and I know this is a great thing, Rise Up October, or October Rising, if you will. Yeah. You have great links to the radical imagination just with the month of October, as we know. Yeah. October 1917, the October Revolution of Archie Shepp in the Jazz Revolution in the 60s. So many resonations here where these connections should be drawn. And particularly for those inside Rikers, because the educational program would be also tremendously important. Not only giving them, quote, better lives. Better lives are happening through the development of our thinking. This is what ultimately I think the radical imagination. How do we think and act together? Not only how we act.
So there's a subversive message.
Yes, absolutely.
In both of what you're saying here, coming from different traditions.
Yes.
I know you were quite moved this morning by what we saw, and it seemed like you had some real question as to whether or not to get arrested this morning. And, free yourself in a sense, or how would that be a statement of liberation, would you think?
Would you just fill into that?
You talked about this, this moral stance and awareness, and then action, praxis. Once you see that sense of truth before you, what's the next step? As we imagine, and we had that opportunity, and I know there was a sort of dilemma there for both of us.
Maybe it had to be simple about it. I have a number of responsibilities that are urgent on this weekend, tonight and tomorrow morning. Yeah. And if I thought that my body was more than symbolic to the actions at Rikers Island this morning, I hope that I would think, well, then I better stay here and do this. But I don't. I think these are, as I indicated in some remarks earlier, this is a ritual. It's an important ritual. Protest is an element of a ritual, and it is actually meeting a ritual, as I also said, of the ritual of torture and state violence.
Who's in control?
Well,
that's the drama that was going on there.
And the definition of control, of course, is, well, in control of what? And of course,
exactly.
Insofar as the state wishes to control essentially property matters, it can use the fear mechanisms to accomplish that. But, as Michael's pointing out, to be asking existential questions is to take control of the most profound elements that any human has, which is herself, her actual self, the mystery of the selfhood, and how it will be used. And so it really is something that a human has potentially. Many abdicate this freedom, so they don't have it, right? But in principle, the human is free to choose how to apply her life his life to the wider world, insofar as her imagination allows her to act. And my choice today is not to get arrested, but I have, I hope, 20, 30 years of life in front of me, and I expect to be using my life
I'm sure you will.
in ways to, as I think of it, one metaphor would be that a vehicle that is deep in a rut and is moving along a rutted path, I'm talking about state capitalism, this system we've got, really existing capitalism. The only way to get it out of that rut is to put something in there that's going to break the wheel in some way and move it in a different direction. So there'll be many chances today, but to be aware of one's freedom in this regard is also an educational feature. And so you pose the question in the most basic way. So many people are indeed, they appear to be satisfied with a material flow in their life. That's called middle class. We know that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's as true today as it was when Thoreau enunciated that phrase, and he's not the one that invented it. You can take that all the way back to Plato, thank you. And any number of teachers in between. The question of coming awake to one's freedom, I won't extend my comments about the men I have known in prison, in Attica and in Sing Sing, at length. I'll say only briefly. One of the features that has so drawn me to teaching and participating in open-ended conversations with men inside is very commonly there are individuals in our prisons who have come to themselves. They have recognized their freedom in a new way. This is, of course, Malcolm X's story, among many others. This is a fascinating thing. Does it mean that prison works? It wakes people up?
Right.
No, it does not. As I've often said, what it means is that just as sometimes you see a green shoot breaking through a slab of concrete that's been poured, the green shoot owes nothing to the concrete that it amazingly seems to have cracked. Zero. The concrete's not good. It's simply that the human force, if you will, the force of imagination is sometimes so irresistible that it can break even through that, and then it really becomes noticeable. And I've been privileged to be with many men, not women, I haven't been in women's prisons, but with many men inside who are coming to themselves. And I would say that I have had more satisfyingly profound conversations about the spiritual and existential reality in more concentration in prison than in the populations outside prison.
But this is somewhat different. The social activism we're talking about here, Michael, too, is this going,
well,
it includes but goes beyond?
Well, I'd like to go back to this notion of freedom. I mean, you know, with freedom, and, you know, the freedom that most people experience in the United States, it seems like, is threefold. They have a freedom to buy a house. That dream is drying up, as we know. That's the end of the American dream. And as George Carlin very aptly put it many years ago, you have to be asleep. They call it the dream because you have to be asleep to believe in it. But this freedom of owning one's house or purchasing one's house or shelter isn't gone, but this is a myth in America that keeps people motivated. The other freedom, of course, the freedom to shop. The consumerist culture.
Choose between Crest and Colgate.
And choose, yes, exactly. And then, of course, the third is the freedom of mobility, that you can travel anytime. So, but this is not really freedom, because with freedom, the kind of freedom existentially and perhaps spiritually, brings with it is an enormous responsibility. And this is something that people are afraid of. I think people become afraid of freedom because what it does bring with it is this responsibility to not only oneself, but to a community, that you begin to become aware of not only your ethos, you know, but your role in the ethos. and becoming maybe even partially a historical actor once you come to these kind of terms. So freedom is something that we have really forgotten to talk about. We talk about freedom being out of prison. To go back to another thing that the Reverend has said, that we, in a way, we all live, in Nietzsche's terms, a prison house of language. And when he sees these conversions or these people coming to terms through their radical imagination or through maybe an existential, conversion or commitment, that somehow the radical imagination is allowing for some light in this prison house of language. A new process, if you will, of articulation. That all of us suffer from this prison house of language,
which
behind
is bars
part,
or not. Yes,
where is it
going?
Or not? Where are we going?
Yeah, where are we going?
So this is a
it's much
a
of what this
metaphor
show's
that we
about,
should
right?
use. And of course we all know the song "All Along the Watchtower." Dylan, sometimes I think this whole world is one big prison yard. Some are prisoners, some are guards, and this speaks to a kind of almost instead of calling it globalization, why don't we call it transnational garrison states? Because we're all living in this kind of very broad kind of, prison yard, Yeah, but please,
No, I'm just curious. So if you had Michael there in the pulpit and you were, going.
I don't want to.
Well, no, okay, all right.
Anyway, that's all right.
Nominally, I know. Well, he would be in the Congress. Here's the sermon.
Right, the sermon.
Yeah,
Okay.
would you be giving this sort of sermon to your congregants?
I do all the time.
Yeah,
I know you do.
yeah,
Okay,
I mean, there's an ancient Buddhistic as well as Christian, and in some ways, you give me a moment. No, I can find it in the Hebrew Bible as well. There's a very strong current about what freedom really is in all the great spiritual traditions. I happen to know those three best. And one of their characteristics is that by your own framing of which this language prison, by your own inarticulateness about the nature of your person, you have dumped yourself into a miserable hellhole, and you are responsible for that, in that sense, by accepting a set of terms and not recognizing what your person really is, or could be.
And not becoming the historical figure you mentioned. What did you mean by that?
Well, a historical role where one begins to recognize one's place in
Same
history.
Thing
Yes,
in a relationship to the
relationship to the community, to the ethos. You become part of an ethos rather than just self and other relations, or freedom versus slavery relations. It becomes a much broader context where you see yourself much more part of a collective radical imagination than an individual, whatever. I just have to mention, I've done a lot of work recently on a French philosopher who was in prison during the 70s. His name is Bernard Stiegler, and he was arrested and sentenced. I think it was multi years. He spent 6 years in a French prison for armed robbery. He was a member of the French Communist Party. He went to prison and, while in prison, multiple conversions, mostly philosophical exercises that he did. And now is probably one of the leading, if not the leading thinker of technology and our relationship to the technological epoch that we're living in. Extremely prolific.
Name again?
Stiegler, S-T-I-E-G-L-E-R, Bernard Stiegler, who has given lectures here in the States at various universities, but has his own institute. But this is an example of someone in a French prison, who was able to correspond to the outside, and one of the correspondents was Jacques Derrida. And once he was out, they whisked him through, they meaning, Derrida and some of his friends, whisked him through a program so that he could both teach, make a living, once he was released from prison. And a very extremely successful story of this. But this is something we need more of, and it's very interesting in the French system, which I've studied for a number of years. In the French prison system, there are libraries still. And the most taken out book, not ironically, is Jean Genet's A Thief's Journal, right? But number 5 is Spinoza's Ethics. And it goes to show you that there's something that is very, very activating in terms of the project of reading, which is also part of the radical imagination. What does it mean to read? How does reading become transformative activity? And it's mentioned Malcolm X in the section called Saved in his autobiography, which is a wonderful chapter on how he came to learn, going through the dictionary and the worlds that opened up to him. And this is also something we forget. We beyond that of our, focus on the injustice, the awful conditions at Rikers. But what are we doing for the educational, mix? Are we, is it enough just to abolish the prisons? No, not really, because we have to have something else going on.
You remember how in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he was beginning to read because one of the household thought it was, a child thought it was interesting to teach Frederick Douglass to read, but didn't have a sense, because she was a child of the master, if I remember, of how significant this was for him.
Was going to be.
But in observing the angry, fearful reaction of the master to what his daughter had been teaching kind of idly, Douglass, this is the breakdown of the prison of language, he sees, if he's that angry about my learning this tool, there must be more here than I could be aware. And look what flowered forth in
absolutely.
Self-education. And of course, that's not the right word, self-education, but education that flowered forth there.
Absolutely. Well, you've taught in prison? I've taught.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, those programs have been cut?
No,
have been
not,
for
not
many
the
years,
ones,
but not
there's
the
a
ones,
master's program at Sing Sing, which is
still
is private. What's been cut are public funds.
Who goes in there then? Well, who's going in there?
The New York Theological Seminary is the sponsor of, with private donations to the seminary, of this one-year intensive course leading to a master's degree. It's only eligible, those who are eligible must have a bachelor's, and some of them have gained that through Mercy College, which does also have a private course of study at Sing Sing. Sing Sing may be among the maxes of the state, the most progressive in its administration of all the maxes of New York State.
And also very newsworthy was this Bard prison initiative, how they built a debating team that took on
Harvard.
Right, which is very interesting. It goes to show you, and then of course, you can build. We need grand myths, right? Such as Denzel Washington's film, the great, the film that he played in The Great Debaters, which is actually based on a Communist Party member in Texas, who actually educated this group, and they didn't go up against Harvard, but they beat Howard University, which was the then elite black school in the United States. So it goes to show you, what can really be done.
Right.
And why funds would be cut, going back to what you said, the state is I think very well aware of this. The state consciousness, if you have an educated prison population, forget it.
Absolutely.
As you go forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's partly what
Don't
our
want
efforts were trying to do.
George Jackson's created, no more George Jacksons, no more Mumias, etc.
So both of your imaginations here that we're from this, spiritual.
We're doing mostly memory and imagination here today.
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, but it's crucial to the evolution of this program, isn't it?
Sure.
To have the intellectual, the philosophical, the imaginative foundation here, that we can even begin to then move forward and come up with the sort of policies and programs and situations to put people that would really concretize what you're both talking about. Isn't that what is also necessary, to just go beyond individual transformation here, but to set up a social structure, economic structure, political structure, as you were saying, perhaps alternative political structure. Stanley and Cornell were talking about.
From the standpoint, we really need alternative education and community built that way. I'm not so sure about policy. Policy always seems to lead to, sort of a semi-disaster at the end. We've seen this over many years. I mean, I know this is part of a long discussion, and we don't have so much time to discuss it. Whether that policy and trying to go that way would be a really viable solution. I think we really have to work really outside the box at this point, and outside the box of the state as much as possible at this point.
Yeah. And I think what it means is that the experiments that we engage in and encourage others to engage in, because we can't be everywhere, and no individual can, will not have the ambit to change everything. They will actually be intensive experiments which are thoroughly educative. Now, for example, take Rick Wolf's proposal for the self-directed enterprise, where the workers
cooperatives.
Worker self-directed enterprise. It's an ugly little acronym, but WSDEs. That idea, as he points out in the book that you mentioned earlier, Democracy of Work, can exist alongside really existing capitalism. You don't have to wait to throw all one over and try to make everybody do this. I think, just generalizing a bit from that, that's the way that the revolution must come, is with very concrete and successful experiments where the humanity, and I love the way you put it, where the freedom an individual emerges into the ethos. And says, I must serve a community, and he or she begins to concretize which community and how, and it isn't generalizations, and they're not writing philosophical tomes. Some are. That's a good thing to be doing too. But I mean, say workers cooperative, that would be a way to show up in an educative way. And these things have to happen. And I also believe, with regard to this matter of police violence and police brutality, there isn't one law that would change everything. You couldn't possibly find a policy. But it does occur to me that you could find a city where there was sufficient support from the people and the police commissioner, the mayor, whatever, where you experiment with and Richmond, California is one of my candidates for this.
Tell us a little about that.
Where there's sufficient consciousness, in the important sense of that word, consciousness, of what might be possible. Sufficient imagination, rooted in our term here, as to experiment with ways of shifting the methods. One feature of what the chief of police in Richmond, California is up to, he recognizes that it does not work at all to tell the police that they have quotas of punishment to bring to the desk every night if they want to rise. That's the way most of these police systems do work, on quotas of negativity. He has quotas for positivity. Seems simple, but it's immense. Show me that you have been in the community having positive interactions with school children, with workers' cooperatives, whatever.
Helping
you've been
in
out there. Prove it
medical
to me,
emergencies,
and then
whatever,
you're going to get merits in pay and promotion. If all you show me are negatives and who you hit, that's not going to help you.
So that's been going on now for...
Oh, I'm not really an expert
well, that's
on
a
Richmond.
concrete...
It's very concrete.
way that this imagination can manifest itself, is what you're saying. So, well, thank you so much, both, for being here today. We will be continuing on with this conversation. I hope our audience has gotten, a much better idea of what this show is about. And we need their help as well, their input. To make this really into something that...
I think we raised, both of us, in differing ways, a very good starting point. We really need to start thinking about how we build institutions, rather than working only with the existing institutions and this critique. And this is very, very important for the left in general, to be thinking about all the time, because there's going to be a tremendous projection, and I know we'll go here later, onto Bernie Sanders as a new kind of savior, etc. A new left deus ex machina, so to speak. Correct?
Well, we are going to have his
anyway,
chief economic advisor
people,
here,
yes,
and Rick
and
will
some
be here
people that
debating.
work with him as well.
And
as
so on.
Rick. Yeah.
But listen, let me,
please.
part of our show will be involving commentary, and I would like to offer this as our closing remarks to our audience. This week, the New York Times came out with a strong editorial describing why the police want prison reform and the need to have, as they put it, less incarceration, not more, to keep all Americans safe. It described this remarkable moment as 130 of the nation's top law enforcement officials, including big city police chiefs, sheriffs, prosecutors, attorney generals, who have joined the call to end the harsh, counterproductive practices and policies that have driven America's devastating prison boom, destroyed communities, as we've talked about, and written off an entire generation of young men of color. Officials who have spent their hard careers fighting crime have stood up to say that too often this aggressive approach has only made matters worse. The Times was right to underscore the central role the police and prosecutors have long played in creating and sustaining the current incarceration crisis. And it remains to be seen, for example, how the group will square its push for fewer arrests with aggressive policing philosophies like the deeply problematic broken windows approach, which, of course, was pioneered by New York Commissioner William Bratton, a member of this new group. Yet there is a call for more alternatives to arrest and prosecution, the reduction or elimination of overly severe sentencing laws, and the rebuilding of relations with local communities, especially those of color. If we've not reached the promised land, it seems that it just might be over the horizon. Over the horizon again. Pressure this time might really get the police to begin to beat their guns and tasers into plowshares, and the line truly seems ready to lie down with the lamb. The radical imagination is on the verge of victory. Or is it? What truly would a transformative justice system look like? Politically, economically, spiritually, intellectually. We've tried to describe a little bit about what that might mean in this program today. But it should be obvious that a transformative justice system needs to clearly differentiate itself from both hardliners and reformers. It should see the system as a reflection of the larger political, economic, and moral order, often helping to maintain that order. The same dynamics of control, domination, and inhumanity occurring in our criminal justice system is duplicated in the abuse and destruction of the environment. Endless wars, creation and perpetuation of poverty around the world, the destruction of true democracies, and a crushing of the human spirit. To counteract that, the transformative imagination message should be a message of radical love and spiritual toughness in the civil rights, welfare rights, and human rights tradition. The prophetic tradition that speaks truth to power, as contained in all the great belief in secular humanist traditions, is bedrock and cornerstone of what a transformative justice system and transformative world would look like and sound like. For this change to occur, we would first need to see the links between that justice system and an economic system rooted in profiting by its desire to create scapegoats, perpetuate a never-ending cycle of fear, violence, and militarism that rationalizes its control and domination of the resources and the environment, and the people of this world for its greed and need for empire. Rick Wolff, who will be on this show in a few weeks, Democracy at Work is his book, and he has eloquently pointed out this essential master-slave relationship in contemporary corporate America, a plutocracy and oligarchy of greed and fundamental white privilege, attempting to destroy what is left of our already limited democracy. This economic master-slave relationship is even more clearly played out in our modern Jim Crow system of mass incarceration. Psychiatrist James Gilligan, the country's foremost authority on violence, has pointed out that all rates of violence are higher in countries that have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income. It should not surprise anyone that the United States has the highest levels of violence and the highest levels of economic inequality. And that economic inequality is played out most definitively in our prison and criminal justice system, which overwhelmingly incarcerates the poor and the very poor. For Gilligan and his vision of a transformative justice system, Rikers Prison should be closed immediately. Therapeutic communities of education, nurturing, love, and counseling should take its place. People do need to be humanely restrained, but not punished. These are people whose anger and violence has manifested itself as a result of the humiliation, the disrespect, the shame they've experienced in the larger system, including in their families, immediate communities, and schools. Tens of millions of other Americans also experience these emotions and hurts that get structured in a variety of other dysfunctional and hurtful ways. Punishment in any of its forms has no place in such a criminal justice system. Therefore, for all of us, it should be more and more apparent that a transformative justice system along the political, economic, spiritual, and intellectual lines we describe in this show would represent a major difference in most of the thinking of both the hardliners and reformers. The meeting and call by 130 of the nation's top law enforcement officials advocating prison reform is a welcome step, but there are many, many more steps, and we still have a long way to go for the radical imagination to help bring about a world that can heal and transform the unfinished experiment that is America. And we hope that this show can be part of that transformation. Thank you all for listening to The Radical Imagination this evening. We hope you will join us every week at 8 p.m. Sunday evening as we continue this dialogue and search for a more progressive and humane world. Thank you so much to the Radical Reverend Stephen Phelps, and my Greek comrade, co-host, Michael Palias, for joining us on tonight's show. And we look forward for Peter next week on our further show. Good night, take care, and see you next week.